Hi. All right. Well, welcome to Advice and Wisdom, May 2015. My name is Doug Noll, and I am the host of this series. It's a free series because I have learned that there are many people who have questions that they really don't have anybody to turn to. And so I thought it might be kind of a fun idea to set up a webinar series that I wouldn't charge for to answer questions about life, finances, money. And each time I come on, which is about every 5 to 6 weeks, I pick a topic and talk about it and answer any questions you have. For those of you who have never been to one of these webinars before, I am a lawyer turned peacemaker. I practiced law for 22 years, and then I went back to school and got my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies, and left the practice of law, a very successful trial practice, and became a peacemaker. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so. I work as a full-time mediator and an arbitrator, and I'm also a teacher and a trainer and a law professor. I teach at the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at the Pepperdine Law School, and I'm also on the faculty at San Joaquin College of Law in Clovis, California. And I'm also on the core faculty of the American Institute of Mediation. So I travel a fair amount teaching people how to deal with conflict, both mediators and non-mediators alike. In fact, on Wednesday I'm traveling to Dallas, where I'll be teaching a 2-day workshop at Southern Methodist University. And if anybody's interested in attending that workshop, I think there's still room. And so if you go to the smu.edu website and look around for the conflict resolution program, you should see the workshop up there. I'll be spending 2 days teaching how to deal with entrenched beliefs. In other words, if you're in a conflict or you're in a situation where you've got somebody who's locked into a really deep belief structure that's getting in the way of getting things done, how do you deal with that? As a leader, as a business owner, as a mediator, as a lawyer with a client, or in any other HR person, wherever you might be, what are the tools? This is going to be a very intense workshop. We're going to be learning a lot about some of the skills I'll be talking about in this webinar. So the topic of tonight is emotions, and let me start off and talk about why I think this is a really critical topic that is ignored pretty much by everybody. I'm going to make a bold statement here, we are 98% emotional and 2% rational. Descartes had it all wrong. Everything that we're learning from neuroscience is now pointing to the fact that every single decision we make during our waking moments is all influenced deeply by emotions. We are emotional beings, and we have a small bandwidth for some logical thinking and logical reasoning, but almost everything is colored by our emotional experience. And yet we live in a culture where emotions, especially negative emotions like rage and anger and hatred and disgust, are considered negative, bad, evil things. And even in some circumstances and in some contexts, positive emotions are considered to be inappropriate. If you can think of being exuberant or joyful or happy or excited in a staid banking meeting, those emotions probably, if displayed inappropriately, won't win you a lot of respect. So our culture is like that. And what's interesting is if you compare Western culture, and I'm going to make some very broad generalizations here, there's obviously huge variations in every culture, but just to give you the sense of how emotions create such a difficult problem for us in the Western culture. In Asian cultures, emotions are treated very differently. Emotions, instead of looking at emotions as polarities, as either good or bad, in Asian cultures, because of Taoism and Confucianism, people see in every good emotion there's some bad, and in every bad emotion there's some good. So it's the yin yang or the I Ching, and so they have a sense of balance around emotions that allows them to hold contradictory concepts in their heads as part of the Gestalt. And of course, when taken to an extreme, that leads to a certain fatalism that some might consider to be a weakness of Asian culture. Here in the West, we have an Aristotelian view of the world, which is it's dichotic, which means that it's either or. And so emotions are either good or they're bad, or even more telling from an Aristotelian, meaning Aristotle, the old Greek philosopher, is you're either emotional or you're not. And from the time of Aristotle and the Greeks through the Enlightenment period, emotions have always thought to be irrational or bad or wrong or whatever negative, pejorative label you want to put on. Hold on, we've got somebody here that says they can't hear or see anything. So I would suggest refresh your page. It's a problem. And it really becomes a problem in our daily lives, because if we are having this emotional experience every day and we are emotionally avoidant in the sense that we either try to deny or repress or fail to acknowledge the fact that we and the people around us are having an emotional experience, it can create a lot of chaos. I do a lot of work in maximum security prisons. Some of you know about the Prison of Peace project, where my colleague Laurel Coffer and I teach people who are serving life sentences, many of them murderers, to be peacemakers and mediators in the prison. And I have seen over the last 5 years firsthand the effect that deep emotional trauma causes to human beings. And I'm not excusing any of the things that cause these people to be in prison for life or for long-term sentences, but you can certainly see when you hear their stories that the trauma that they suffered programmed them to commit really heinous and awful things. And that, of course, is at the far extreme of what emotional abuse can be about. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to emotions, and if possible, we can learn how to be with our emotions, whether they're positive, joyous emotions or negative emotions like anger, frustration, anxiety, rage, whatever it might be, and just learn how to deal with them and accept them as part of our existence. And once we start to accept our emotional existence and recognize what emotions are and how they work and how they influence our behaviors and what it feels like and how to not react to them when they come through, all of a sudden you feel like you have a huge amount of control over a huge aspect of your life that for many people is just a black box, like I can't control my emotions. So that's why I think emotions are really important. And I have seen in my teaching and my training and in my own work as a mediator and a peacemaker that people come into conflict, for example, and they're highly emotional. We can't get anything done in terms of finding resolution to the conflict or doing problem solving or engaging in negotiation until we can de-escalate those emotions. So learning how to de-escalate an angry person or an upset person or an angry kid or an angry elderly parent, learning how the skills to de-escalate that person is critical if we want to be able to have a dialogue or a conversation that has some meaning and can lead to some kind of productive result. So again, I think that understanding emotions and accepting the fact that we are emotional beings becomes really important. So let me talk just very quickly about kind of how emotions evolved in us as human beings, and a little bit, not too deep into the neuroscience of it all, but just a little bit to skip over the waves to give you a little bit of a foundation. So emotions exist and evolved to make us pay attention to our environment. If we didn't have emotions, we wouldn't be able to pay attention and motivate ourselves to approach those things that are really good for us, in other words, that will propagate our genes into the future, which essentially is food and water and shelter and sex. Those are the four primary things we'll approach for at a very primitive level, and avoid the things that could be dangerous and might clean us out of the gene pool. And so we have, that could be all kinds of things like heights and animals and predators and rushing rivers and all kinds of dangerous stuff that can easily harm or injure or kill basically an unarmed 5.5 to 6 foot two-legged mammal with no claws, fangs, teeth, or any natural weapons to protect itself. So emotions evolved in us to allow us to react to, pay attention to, and react to our immediate environment in an appropriate way. Of course, probably many millions of years ago, the emotions were pretty straightforward and primitive. So we would have anger, for example, or rage or fear, causing us to take action to either remove ourselves from danger or to protect ourselves from danger by perhaps freezing, like rabbits do when a hawk is overhead, or if in the worst case situation, having to fight. What's really interesting is that the emotional centers of the brain, which are really I'll give you a quick brain anatomy. So imagine that my arm is the spinal cord, and so at the top of the spinal cord there's like a small ball, like a small baseball, and that's called the medulla, and it's kind of where the brainstem goes to the brain. And then off to the side, there is a little smaller bundle of nerves that's called the cerebellum, meaning little brain, and that handles a lot of our anatomic stuff. And then kind of over the top and wrapped around the medulla is a whole bunch of little brain components, if you will, that have to do with memory and emotion and some sensory processing. And it's generally called the limbic system, broadly described, because it's in a circle or a limbus around the brain. It includes things like the hippocampus and the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the amygdala, things you've probably heard of. And all of these little components evolved to help us in many ways, pay attention to and remember things so that we could better succeed in moving the genes forward. And then wrapped over all of that, so you've got the cerebellum here and the medulla and then the limbic system here, and then wrapped over all of this is what we call the cortex. And the cortex is basically a flat sheet of neurons, and they're in columns. They're stacked up in columns, and then they're crumpled in. So if you lay it out, it's like 9 square feet or three square feet on the side. I mean, it's really a pretty big piece of mat that lays out if you laid it all out. And it crumples. It's crumpled in. How are you going to get this 9 square foot of basically inch or 2-inch stuff into our head? And so you got to crumple it up like a piece of paper. Here, it looks like this. I mean, here's the flat sheet. This is our cortex. So to get it in, well, actually, the way you got to really do it is you got to crumple it over the top like this. And so when you look at a picture of a brain, you'll see it all crumpled up, and there are the fissures and the sulci and all the stuff. And what's really interesting is all those little valleys and creases that you see in the brain are in the same place in every single human brain. Very small variations. And that's the other thing that's really interesting about this is all human brains are physiologically constructed pretty much the same way. Sure, there are variations, but you're going to find the same basic components in the same basic place. And most human beings, if they're within a standard deviation of being normal, are going to have brains that are fairly identical to each other, because we all express emotions, we all experience emotions, and that's what makes us human. And the emotion that I have here sitting in the United States, in California, is the same kind of emotion that a person sitting, an Inuit up in the Arctic is going to have, which is the same kind of emotion that a person over in the East is going to have, that a person in the Ukraine is going to have. We all experience the same basic emotions as they arise out of the neuronal interactions in our brains. Now, how those emotions express themselves and how we express the emotions in behaviors and actions is modulated a lot by culture and a lot by our upbringing. So I may experience anger and get really pissed off and cuss and swear and go crazy, and a person in another culture, that would be completely inappropriate. And so they will hold the anger in, and it would not be appropriate to display that anger. But we are still experiencing the same emotion. It's just that the display rules might be different. Or, and I'll get into this in a minute, that there's other factors that might factor into how we behave with our emotional experience. But fundamentally, every human being who's normal, I'm not talking about people who are mentally ill or have development problems or have severe mental illness or even moderate mental illness. I'm talking about normal people. We all have the same basic brain, and that brain has the capacity for generating the same emotional experience. All kinds of experiments have been done to determine whether people of different cultures and in different countries with different languages and different completely different ways of living can recognize the same facial expressions pan-culturally. And the research has conclusively shown that, yes, people identify the exact same emotions pan-culturally across all cultures and across genders, which indicates that we seem to be hardwired for having a shared emotional experience. And that's good news, because it means that at bottom, even though we may be working with people or in conflict with people who are so radically different from us on the exterior that we can't even understand how we can possibly ever reach agreement, but underneath, certainly as a peacemaker and a mediator, if I recognize that we've got human brains in the room, they're responding to a situation, and their emotional state is going to be the same pretty much everywhere, and it's pretty predictable, that gives me a lot of comfort, because I know that the interventions that I use in one place, if culturally translated appropriately in another place, might be effective. So, and once I understood the universality of emotion across all of the human space, it was very liberating to me in many ways. I no longer had to worry too much about dealing with people from different cultures as thinking that I was going to stub my toes or completely not understand it. All right, so we got the neurophysiology of this, and I will say also that emotions evolved in human brains in pretty interesting ways. So, for example, take the emotion of disgust. Disgust arises out of a part of the brain called the insula. Again, it's in that limbic area in the middle of the brain, and the insula is about 3 or 4 neurons, not very far away from the sensory cells of our taste buds and our nose, our nostril, our sense of smell. So the insula evolved to protect us from eating bad food, because if we smelled or tasted something that was disgusting, what that meant was that stuff was not good for us, and so we stayed away from it. And so that's how we avoid poisoning ourselves or eating rotten meat or spoiled milk or whatever. Well, the brain was really good at co-opting existing systems for other purposes. And so when we think about the emotion of disgust, it also arises in the insula. And our brains were able to evolve the use of emotional disgust by using the same physical component that's associated with physical disgust, especially around food. So when we say that's disgusting, and we're not talking about food or something physical that's gross, we're actually using a part of the brain that evolved initially to protect us from food. And that's true with just about every part of our emotional components, with a few exceptions. So it's very interesting how the brain co-opts stuff, and so it evolves over time as these emotions became evolutionarily adaptive. And what I mean by evolutionarily adaptive is that it helped our predecessors propagate and move their genes forward into the gene pool. Okay, so now we've got the brain that produces these emotions. They're also modulated by neurochemicals. You've probably heard of serotonin. or oxytocin or dopamine. Those are the cortisol is another one. Endorphins, you've probably heard of endorphins, endogenous morphines. So these are all chemicals, amino acids that are produced either in the brain or in the central nervous system that can affect how we feel, literally, physically how we feel, and they are some of the drivers of how emotions are created and propagated and intensified or inhibited in the brain. Take serotonin, for example. Serotonin is associated with all kinds of human behaviors, but the most interesting one is affiliative behavior. If in a very famous experiment, serotonin, they took a group of macaque monkeys, a tribe, and they isolated the alpha male and they chemically reduced his serotonin levels, and within a week he was an outcast. None of the females would have anything to do with him. Poor guy, and so then they gave him a supplement to re-up his serotonin level, and by the way, it's called HTP, 5-HTP, which you can buy in any drugstore or any supermarket in the pharmacy. 5-HTP, hydroxytryptophan, at 5-hydroxytryptophan, 5-HTP. It's in Turkey, and it naturally raises serotonin levels. And as soon as the serotonin levels naturally started to rise again, he became the alpha monkey again. And so what the researchers discovered was being the alpha monkey was not what Darwin thought, which is being big and aggressive, having big fangs and being able to growl and sneer and be angry. It was how well you could get the females to affiliate with you to give you social power to be the head guy. And that seems to be directly related to serotonin. And we know in humans, for example, low serotonin levels relate to depression and also relate to violence. People who have low serotonin, some of those people have, it's not everybody, but because there are a lot of factors about violence, but there's some studies that show correlation between violent activity and low serotonin. When you take a drug like Prozac is the trade name for the chemical fluoxetine. Fluoxetine is known as a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That's a long, big word. Basically, what it means is that the chemical holds the serotonin in the synapse between the cells longer, so more of it can be absorbed by the receiving side on the dendritic side of the neuron. And so what that means is that the effects of serotonin last longer. And so that's why people take Prozac for depression, because their serotonin hangs out there longer, so it can have a longer effect on the receiving side of the neuron. So that's just one example. Another one, oxytocin, is associated with orgasm, lactation, breastfeeding, and it's also associated with trust. Paul Zak, a neuroeconomist down at the Claremont Graduate School in Southern California, did a groundbreaking study several years ago that showed that when he manipulated oxytocin in males, he found that higher oxytocin levels led to more trust with a stranger, and lower oxytocin levels led to mistrust with a stranger. So again, emotions are being modulated by neurochemicals. So we've got this complex system of the brain and brain chemistry that creates an emotional experience that we are having every moment of our waking life. And I suppose you could argue that we could be experiencing emotions while we dream too. We've all had nightmares. That's an emotional experience. And we probably had dreams of where we've enjoyed it. So I would suggest that perhaps in our dreams at night, we can have an emotional experience as well. So now it gets interesting, because the emotional centers of our brain are disconnected, well, not disconnected, not well connected to other parts of our brain. So we will feel impulses that we call feelings or emotions, but our ability to label what those are is really limited. And it requires us to have a scheme or a category of emotions, some sort of setup, so that we can describe the feeling that we're having in some kind of way. And this is called categorization of emotions. And it's a learned experience. We learn how to categorize emotions. When do we learn this? Well, we learn this in the terrible twos when we're going between 2 and 4, because it's in that age group that children, or little children for the first time, are starting to experience, as their brains develop, they're starting to experience more and more emotions, and they're building an experiential library of what it's like to have all these different emotional experiences. And one of the reasons it's called the terrible twos is not only because they're learning what the word I is and me and no, but they're also learning what anger is, and rage, and happiness, and exuberance, and joy, and all the basic emotions that eventually complexify into the adult human experience. They're learning all of that at age 2. Now, here's what's really interesting. You've got to be able to, if you are going to navigate your emotional experience well, first of all, you have to have a well-established category of emotions. So that means the content that you have a good vocabulary of emotions, and you're able to associate memory with emotion, and you're able to articulate what those emotions are in an effective way. There are many people who have a very poor categorization set up in their memories because especially in Western culture, we have made it evil or wrong or less than human to pay attention to our emotional experience. And so one of the reasons why people are so drawn to theater or movies or television or reality shows where it's all this huge emotional stimulation is because we have a hard time experiencing our own emotions, and so we only feel comfortable being stimulated vicariously by other emotions. So when we think about content, we think about content and the ability, the vocabulary of emotions we have, moving in a hierarchy from very broad. So it could be starting at a very base level. We can say emotions are either pleasant or they're unpleasant. And then we could move up a level, and we could take that pleasant and we could move it in from satisfied to feeling joyous. And if it were unpleasant, we could say fear versus anger. And then we can move up to another level. And as we move up in each hierarchy, we can further subdivide and categorize these emotions to describe even more particular and discrete feelings that we experience in our emotional lives. Most people can't do that. And what's really interesting is in Western culture, since we put a premium on positive emotions and we are avoidant of negative emotions, most people have a very weak categorization of negative emotions and usually an okay but not great categorization of positive emotions. What I have seen in the prison working with ex-gang members, is that when we first start out with them, they have almost no categorization of emotions, either fear or anger, rage and violence. That's all they know. And to get them to even describe anything with more particularity is almost impossible. They simply don't have the words or the categories or the processing power to figure that out. So that becomes very important when we're talking about ending the drama in life. We got to realize that the people who really have a lot of drama in their lives, or they're really emotional, or they're really drama, they may not have the cognitive tools. They may have never developed the cognitive tools to allow them to recognize what their emotional experience is. And that gets us to another concept that I think is really useful, which is called emotional granularity. Big word, emotional granularity. And what that means is the more specific we can get and the more detailed we can get about describing our emotional experience in the moment, the better off we are. And we find that people who have high levels of emotional granularity, in other words, they're very aware of what they're feeling, interestingly tend to be better educated and tend to be emotionally more stable than people who have low levels of emotional granularity. So that's where education becomes important, because just general education, not even emotional education, seems to allow people to develop a higher level of granularity, a deeper level of granularity, than people who are not educated. And that's why reading literature is so important in our educational systems, because in literature, the stories and the characters are having emotional experiences, and we are, as children and as young adults and students reading this literature, we are reliving their emotional experiences, which allows us to develop our categories and also to become more granular about our emotions. But if we don't do any reading, if we're illiterate, or if we are not exposed to that kind of educational system, then we tend not to be so emotionally granular, and that gets us into trouble too, because we'll feel these feelings all inside us, and we'll feel this stuff, but we won't be able to articulate what it is, and so people tend to lash out. They tend to lose their impulse control in their prefrontal cortex, and they tend to lash out and become violent. Or they'll argue, or they'll get into conflict, or they'll say things that are inappropriate, or they put, we've all seen it everywhere. And a lot of that is what's going on. We also find that when people do not have a great deal of emotional granularity, especially around negative emotions, it takes a huge amount of prefrontal cortex processing power for them to try to figure out what they're saying. And I got a quote here somewhere. Yeah, let me just read this. This is out of a research paper that I was just reading the other day. With effortful, controlled processing, people can reject adjectives that are not characteristic of their current emotional state, and so they have to really work at trying to figure out what's going on and what's not going on around them. And so that's why people, when they're emotional and they're having an emotional experience, are oftentimes difficult to talk with. And so that then leads into some more practical stuff, and that has to do with emotional invalidation. And here again is a problem we have as a result of the complexity of our brains and the complexity of our culture, and oftentimes poor attention paid on how we are as emotional beings. We emotionally invalidate each other. And when I talk about emotional invalidation, I'm talking about the way we respond to the emotions of others. And so we are told we shouldn't feel the way we feel. We are dictated not to feel the way we feel. We're told we're too sensitive, or we're too dramatic, or we're high maintenance. We can be ignored when we're emotional. We can be judged when we're emotional. We are led to believe that there's something wrong with us for feeling how we feel. And so I got this great list. If you're really interested, you can email me and I'll send you the list. I got this list, like 5 pages long, of emotionally invalidating statements. And so let me just give you some examples. And you might just take out a piece of paper if you're handy and just take a little, if something resonates with you and you've either said this or somebody has said this to you, you might just make a little tick mark. And I'm not going to, there are hundreds of them, so I'm not going to take much time going through them, but let's just see how many tick marks there are. So here's from the group, these are the kinds of emotionally invalidating statements that order you to feel differently. So people say, hey, smile, be happy, cheer up, lighten up, get over it, grow up, get a life, don't cry, don't worry, it'll all be okay, stop whining, deal with it, give it a rest, forget about it, don't be so dramatic, don't be so sensitive, stop feeling sorry for yourself, stop taking everything so personally. Any of those resonate with you? How about some of these? You've got it all wrong. But of course I respect you. But I do listen to you. That is completely ridiculous or absurd. I was only kidding. That's not how things are. I honestly don't judge you as much as you think. So in each of those, those statements are denying your perception or your reality of who you are and what you're experiencing. How about these? Let's try, you must be kidding. You can't be serious. It can't be that bad. Your life can't be that bad. It's nothing to get upset about. It's not worth getting that upset over. There's nothing wrong with you. So in these situations, we're minimizing your feelings. You can see how it's invalidating. How about some of these? This is where some people will use reason to deal with emotions. There's no reason to get upset. you're just not being rational. But it doesn't make any sense to feel that way. Let's look at the facts. But if you really think about it, so here we're responding to another person's emotions by invalidating it by asking them to be rational. How about judging and labeling? Here's some of these judgmental statements. You're a crybaby. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You are an insensitive jerk. You need to get your head examined. You're impossible to talk to. Or how about some of these, turning things around? You are making a big deal out of nothing. You're blowing this way out of proportion. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. And we could go on and on and on. You get the gist. So I'm curious how many tick marks you put. How many of these sound familiar to you? Either you've used them yourself unconsciously, or they have been used on you. These are all examples of emotionally invalidating statements. And what they essentially do is deny the emotional experience of the person that's in front of you. And by denying that, you soothe yourself because you're being around a person who's super anxious, or rather you experience a lot of anxiety around people who are really emotional, and you want their emotionality to go away to make you feel better. So you defend yourself, or you soothe yourself, and so you invalidate. And of course, when you become emotional, people do the same thing to you. It's the worst thing we can do to each other, and yet we do it all the time. We learned it at our parents' knees. They didn't know any better. I mean, guys, we were all emotionally invalidated as children. Grow up. Don't cry. Don't be a sissy. Stop crying. Big men don't cry. You know, I mean, we were told to deny our emotional experience growing up. All of us were. That's part of the male thing. And I would submit that as a result of that, there are a lot of men, myself included, who have gone through a lot of emotional trauma because we had to come to grips with our emotional lives. And having all of this denied to us, repressed our emotional experiences. We repressed our emotional experiences, not knowing how to deal with it, and it led to misery. And it leads to misery. And in extreme cases, it leads to violence. I would guess that I won't say a large, but I'll say a significant cause of domestic violence caused by males is going to be that men who engage in domestic violence have no ability to manage their own emotional experience because they were emotionally abused or invalidated themselves as children. And so how can we expect them to manage strong emotions in a relationship that is intimate? Now, that's a rhetorical question. Of course, they have to do that. Violence is wrong. Totally wrong. There's no excuse for it. But we can understand it better if we understand how our culture tends to negate our emotional experience. And so if we emotionally invalidate, then what we are doing is denying the 98% of us that is emotion. And so that is a huge, huge problem in our society. So what do we do about it? Well, I'll take a few minutes and describe to you some of the techniques that can be utilized for solving these problems that I've developed over the years. And if you want more information, I've got I don't mean to promote stuff on these free webinars, but since we're on the topic, you can go to, if you got a pencil and paper down, and also if you look on the Advice and Wisdom website, you'll see the link to the course. I've got a course online called It's Pure Magic. It's puremagic.com. And that course is a 2.5-hour course. It's 2.5 hours of video lectures. Each lecture is about 15 minutes long, that teaches you deep empathic listening. And I'm going to kind of give you the overview of the course in the next couple of minutes, but you obviously need to take the course or come to one of my workshops or something to really get the mastery of it, but you'll get the gist of what I'm talking about. The idea here is that when you are in the presence of somebody who has a lot of emotion, you've got a drama queen for a girlfriend, or you've got an insensitive, uncaring guy for a boyfriend or a husband. He appears to be insensitive or uncaring. then what you have an emotional situation. And I want to talk about this insensitive, strong, silent type guy. My wife, Alea Dow, has a very interesting perception on this. She thinks that men are far more emotionally sensitive than women are. And that, I don't know whether that's right or not, but it is intriguing because it's her experience that men have a lot more feelings inside them that they're not able to express because of our cultural rules, and that they are easily hurt, they are easily offended, and they're just really little boys wanting to come out and play. And so when you're looking at a man who is repressed and shows no emotions and is stoic, that's just what's on the outside. On the inside, there's probably this cauldron of brewing emotions that are blowing through, that the man, because of years and years and years of acculturation and habitual practice, probably isn't even realizing that that's there. But it's a cause of heart attack and stress and stroke and all kinds of medical diseases. We know that not having a good emotional experience in life leads to a lot of later life trauma, especially in dangerous diseases. And on that subject, just as an aside, the Kaiser Foundation did a great study in San Diego called the ACEs study, ACES, ACEs. And Google Kaiser ACEs study and get a copy and read the summary, because what they found, they looked at something like 15,000 normal middle-class families in San Diego County, California. And what they found, they were looking for what they called adverse childhood experiences, which is the acronym for ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And what they found was that children that had 3 or 4 ACEs had something like a 500% more likelihood of having severe medical problems later in life, whether it would be obesity, diabetes, congestive heart failure, cancer, you name it, any of the deadliest diseases that we suffer from today. 500% more likelihood that they would encounter one of these diseases if they had 3 or 4 ACEs in their childhood. And the ACEs didn't have to be physical abuse. It could be the child could be in a wealthy family or an upper middle class family and just be emotionally ignored, and that would constitute an ACE. It's a study that everybody should read, because it goes to validate what I'm saying about the importance of our emotional lives, especially as children. ACEs study, Kaiser ACEs study, really significant, important study telling us how emotional invalidation, emotional neglect, and even physical neglect, which is more obvious, can lead to severe physical ailments in adulthood. And why is Kaiser interested in that? Of course, well, they're in the business of keeping people healthy, and so they obviously want to know what the etiology of some of these diseases are. And if it turns out to be emotional in childhood, then maybe there's correctives that can be added to that. All right, so getting back to how we deal with emotional people in our lives. All right, there are a couple of different conditions that we have to think about. Let's take the easiest condition, which is somebody's really angry or pissed off, and you're in a pretty good place. You're not too angry, you're not too upset. You're in a place where you can be reasonably attentive to the person. In those situations, the only thing that you have to do, and I'm laughing because it's really not as easy as you think it is, which is why I have a whole course around it. The only thing you really have to do for the person who is being really emotional is be present with them in the moment and simply reflect back what you think their emotional experience is. This is called affect labeling, and I teach you how to do this with a lot of practice, because it does take some practice. But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If you go back to the idea that people have emotional experiences, but they don't have well-developed categories to be able to connect the emotional experience with the prefrontal cortex and then be able to connect that with the speech centers of the brain and the Broca's area of the brain, which and Wernicke's area, which have to do with verbal communication, listening and speaking and vocabulary and stuff like that, none of those circuits are very well connected, and so it becomes very difficult for people to articulate, to cognitively understand what they're feeling, and then beyond that be able to articulate what they're saying. So if you can help them with that process by simply labeling what the emotional experience is. So if you see somebody who's really angry, you would say, you are really angry. And what you are doing is you're basically loaning them your prefrontal cortex for a moment so that they can process and make the connection between the emotional feelings that they're having and try to process that through their prefrontal cortex so they can get understanding about it and then be able to articulate. That takes a huge amount of processing power that is typically not available to people when they're really angry. So by doing that, you allow them to connect the dots, and the miracle happens when you do it. They completely de-escalate. And so all you have to do is label the emotion they're having and say, you are really angry right now. You're really pissed off. You're really frustrated. That's all you have to say. And you don't use I statements, and you don't ask questions. You simply make the statement. And people always say, well, gee, that seems like we're being really pushy and rude. Try it. Test it for yourself. Next time you come across somebody who's emotional, just label their emotion. Say, you are really X. And you will know if you got it right because you will see 4 unconscious responses. So you watch for these responses. The first thing you're going to watch for is a nod of the head. The second thing you're going to watch for is a yeah, or exactly, or oh, yeah. And the third thing you're going to look for is a dropping of the shoulders. Shoulders are going to drop, slump. And the last thing you're going to watch for is a big sigh, like a relief. And basically what people are saying when they do that is, finally, somebody understands me. Now, sometimes, I talk about this too, and I teach you how to deal with pushback. Sometimes if you do it, you don't do it very artfully, if you don't do it very artfully, you'll get pushback like, well, you're not my therapist. What are you talking about? Of course I'm angry. And you'll get pushback. Well, if you get pushback, you stop, don't do it, and you come back and try it again another day or another time. And I talk more about how you deal with that kind of pushback, which is very rare. It happens, but not very, very often. So the point of all of this is that when you are in the presence of somebody who's having an emotional experience, the only way you can really be with them is by helping them label the experience they're having, by not asking questions and by not using I statements, but by a simple you statement. You are whatever the emotion is. You're really sad right now. You're feeling a lot of grief. You feel really disrespected. You're really frustrated. You're really anxious. Whatever it might be. And you guess at it. And there's a whole reason why your guesses are going to be accurate, because of things called mirror neurons, which is a whole set of other lectures. And again, I cover that in all my longer courses. I cover what those are and how they work. So you can guess, and believe it or not, if you just guess, most of the time you'll be right. And even if you're wrong, your speaker is going to come back and say, oh, I'm not angry, I'm frustrated. And then you come back and you say, oh, you're frustrated. Now, you're not going to use I statements, those old stupid reflective listening skills that you learned in high school or wherever, or college in Psych 101, or Counseling 101, where they said, what I hear you saying is you're angry. Wrong. No I statements. All the research shows that when you use an I statement, you are triggering a completely different part of the brain, and now it becomes about you, and it just escalates people even more. So that's how we become present with people, and that's how we avoid emotional invalidation. Instead of telling somebody how they should be or telling them that they're wrong to feel the way we are, we acknowledge and validate their emotional experience in that moment. It takes about 10 seconds. And in that moment, they're able to process and connect their emotional experience with the categorical scheme they've learned over the years make sense of it, and they have this deep sense of completion and closure, like they've really been heard. They've heard themselves and somebody else has heard them, and they completely calm down. It is absolutely magical how it works, which is why I call it it's pure magic. Once you have gathered this, you've developed this foundational skill of emotions, you will notice some things happening to yourself that are really quite remarkable. The first thing that you will observe is that when somebody is being really emotional around you, you're no longer emotional. You stay calm and collected and centered and grounded and in a deep spiritual place where nothing anybody can do or say to you will bother you in that moment, because you're only paying attention to their emotions, not to their words or their behaviors. And it's a very grounding, deep place to be. I was teaching in a middle school this afternoon, and I'm working with some middle school teachers, teaching them how to de-escalate angry students in 90 seconds or less. And I always ask for stories when we start the class. And this one woman told a story about over the weekend about how her husband and her son, who I presume must be 18 or 19, because she described him as 6'6" and 250 pounds, big kid, they totally got into not a physical fight, but into a emotional, verbal altercation. And she described how she used these skills that she was learning, that we had been working on, in labeling emotions, and went out and labeled her son's emotions, and he immediately quieted down. And then she went in the house and did the same thing to her husband, and he immediately quieted down. And then when they were finally calm enough to be in each other's presence, she brought them in again and did the same thing again with them, basically de-escalating both of them in the presence of each other. And she said it was amazing. And she said what was even more amazing is before I would have run out of the house and left because I didn't want to deal with the tension, and these guys would have not talked to each other for weeks, and we were able to get this whole thing resolved in less than 15 or 20 minutes. And the whole weekend was a very peaceful, quiet weekend, and people were really respectful to one another. It was not that it didn't happen, because it was a pretty intense conflict, but they got past it. And she said, and I said to her, so you felt in total control, didn't you? Nothing bothered you. She said that was what was so amazing, is that at no time did I feel in danger or out of control or anxious. I just felt, okay, I'm just in this place where I need to validate their emotional experiences, and once I do that, we'll sit down and figure out what happened and work through the problem. And that's exactly what happened. So she was pretty blown away by that. So that's how we deal with the emotions of those around us. Now, what happens, the second thing that happens, the first is so you get grounded and centered when you're around other people's emotions. That's the reason why, as a mediator and a peacemaker, I can walk into any conflict, even on the verge of violence, and not be knocked off my center, not be bothered, not be worried, not be anxious, not be concerned at all, because I recognize I'm walking into the maelstrom of emotions, and I know exactly what I have to do with those emotions to get people calmed down so that we can start solving a problem. Now, that doesn't mean it happens right away, but I know what happens, and I can be present with these strong emotions, and it doesn't bother me. And it won't bother you either, because I've learned with practice how to do this. The other thing that happened, and we learned this from the prison project, is as people learn how to label the emotions of others, what they start doing is they start affect labeling themselves. And so we would have inmates come up to us and say, you know, the most amazing thing happened. I had a guy come up to me on the yard and just really got in my face. And normally I would have just punched him out. And this time I just said, boy, I'm really angry at this guy. I'm really frustrated. This guy's really disrespecting me. And then the thought came to my head, what do I want to do? And so what are my choices? And I said, well, I can punch him out, but then I'm going to get a 115 and go to AgSec. That's kind of stupid. I don't want to do that. I think I'll just walk away. And it was the first time in this inmate's life that he had made the conscious choice to not engage in violence when he felt disrespected. And he was blown away by it. And so that's one of the huge benefits that comes from this, is that you will find that you can control your own emotions control and manage your own emotions much more effectively as you practice labeling the emotions of others. And all of a sudden, your life opens up because you are able to experience all of the emotions, good and bad, without being triggered by them in any horrible way. And you just recognize this is just what it means to be human. And yeah, right now I'm angry, and right now I'm frustrated, and right now I'm whatever I am, but it'll pass. And I'll be fine. And fundamentally, I'm solid as a human being. And these emotions come up. Alea calls them energy in motion, and that's what it is. It comes up, it crests like a wave, and then it goes away. And I can be present with it in that moment and experience it, and it's not upsetting in the slightest. And so I will have intense emotions. I get frustrated like everybody else, and I'll cuss or do whatever, but it'll, boom, it's gone like that. You know, it doesn't hang around. It doesn't alter my general mood. So that's what we've experienced. And so if we can learn how to be with our emotions in a positive way, as opposed to being the way we have been brought up to be, which is to invalidate ourselves and to invalidate the emotional experiences of others. If we can learn to validate our emotional experiences and the emotional experiences of others, we find that we have much, much more peaceful lives, and the drama goes away. There just is no drama in a life that has the ability to be emotionally centered by focusing on the emotional experiences of others. And that is a great gift. It's a great gift that you can give to yourself. It's a great gift that you can give to all the people around you. Every person, I have incredible stories of people who have written me by email and told me stories of how learning how to be emotionally present with other people has completely changed their lives and the lives of their families and the lives of their coworkers and everything else. I mean, it's really a beautiful thing to watch. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is getting this message out to people so that we can end the suffering that our culture has foisted on us, which is to think that emotions are bad, that we have to invalidate to protect ourselves, that we don't have to be emotional beings, that we can in fact be fully emotional and yet still be completely pragmatic, practical, rational, problem-solving beings. In fact, even be more effective because we're being realistic about the fact that we are emotional beings with little tiny moments of logic and rationality splashed in now and then to solve the problems that are unusual. So that is emotions, how to manage them, how to work with them, how to think about them. If you are able to work on this stuff, you will find that the drama in your life will really go away quite dramatically. Because you will be able to manage the people around you. They will no longer trigger you. And even if they're crazy around you, you will not go crazy because of them. You'll just be able to maintain a poise and equanimity that you thought that only Yoda could manage. So we are at 7:59, almost at the end of the hour. I will take if there are any questions you guys want to put up in the chat room or anything, I can handle that. But I think what I will do is sign off on the recorded part of the video and thank you all for attending and hope that this was useful for you. And then for people who want to stick around for a minute or two and pop some questions on the chat room, I can take those if you wish. So with that, I will sign off on the video and have a great evening.